She had 3 seconds, 3 heartbeats to decide whether she stayed invisible or moved in a way that would change everything. The kitchen clock ticked in the back of her head, the sound of orders printed in a staccato she had learned to obey. Her feet ached in shoes with one sole nearly worn through. In her palm was a tray that smelled of lemon polish and hot bread, and in the tray, a wine glass that was supposed to be empty. Outside, the November rain made the city slick and anonymous. Inside, behind thick curtains and a heavy wooden door, the private room at Romano's was lit like a stage. Red walls, a low chandelier, the kind of place where contracts were signed in whispers and hands left bruises in the air. It had a hum of wealth that sat on top of everything: velvet, polished silver, the faint ghost of old cigar smoke. Tonight, the room held 5 men who moved through it like separate kinds of danger. One of them liked to be called Don Marcelli. Sarah Mitchell walked into that glare with 2 names folded tight in her coat: waitress and mother. When she thought of her daughter, it steadied her. Lily watched her from a picture clipped to the apron, big brown eyes caught mid-smile, strawberry-scented shampoo still in her hair from that morning's hurried bath. Lily was 6, a small house full of Lego and bedtime negotiations, and the reason Sarah had learned to read quick signals in other people's faces. She had 3 seconds because the men at that table did not take long to decide things. They spoke in low chords. A wine-glass would tilt a fraction. A hand would slide something small, almost invisible, across the table. People like Don Marcelli expected the world to be obedient to their gestures. Most of the time it was. Sarah breathed through the moment. Her work was motion. Set a bowl down, fold a napkin, meet a glance. Tonight she had been assigned to the private room because Marco, the floor manager, was a favor owed. Private rooms came with good tips and better trouble. She kept her hands steady. She kept her eyes moving. If you like cinematic, true-to-life stories, subscribe and tell us where you're watching from. The private room at Romano's had a rule: nothing left to the table that could be a risk. No back pockets of strangers' coats, no unattended coats, no open bottles at the far edge of glasses. The server who worked that room had to be a ghost and a surgeon at once, disappear when asked, repair when necessary. Sarah had been a professional in this kind of disappearing for years. She had been invisible to the world since Lily's father left and took half the heat out of the apartment with him. Invisible meant cheaper rent. Invisible meant she could leave the heater on a timer so Lily wouldn't wake up in the dark. But mothers are not always invisible. They are focused.
They remember the weight of breath near them and the timing of small things: where to hide a thermos of soup, how to keep a fever quiet until morning, when to whisper, when to fight. Sarah's hands were the kind of hands that knew how to switch a diaper strap and make a mortgage payment on time. They also knew how to keep a wine glass crystal clear. Don Marcelli was a man who arrived in rumor. He had the slow, controlled weight of someone who expected obedience and have learned to pay for it. He listened more than he spoke. When he did speak, the room tilted a little to his side. Tonight he wore a dark coat and a shirt that had no need of buttons. He sat at the head of the table like a low sun, and his eyes were a color that did not give much away. There were 5 seats filled. Don Marcelli, a thin man in an expensive suit who laughed like a crack of ice. A younger man who kept checking his phone and gave off the smell of someone recently educated on how to be dangerous. An older man with a slow smile who folded napkins as if they were confessions. And Philip Warren, who had hands that moved too clean and the look of someone trained to disappear. Philip had the kind of face that was comfortable in 2 worlds: polite enough in public, precise where it hurt in private. He toyed with a small vial the way some men toyed with pens. It was the kind of thing that looked insignificant until it moved. Sarah set plates. She balanced a dish in one hand while the other steadied a candlestick. She noticed things because she had to. Her eye caught on the vial because it was a thing that did not belong in a place like that. It was too clinical, too clear. It sat in Philip's palm like a thought you shouldn't finish. She had 3 seconds. She saw the tilt of Philip's wrist. It was a motion practiced and slow, not the clumsy fumble of a drink spiked for laughs. It was deliberate, mercifully quiet. A small hand reached, a liquid slipped, and the surface of the wine took a new surface, an intrusion as slick as a whispered lie. Her body moved before she gave it permission. Time narrowed. The first movement was small and perfectly ordinary: the clink of cutlery as she cleared a plate, the jostled position of a water glass. She could have called for help. She could have asked the manager, unfolded a crisis in the open where men would laugh at a woman who assumed danger. Her whole life had trained her that asking for help cost more than she could afford. So she acted with the particular, private kind of courage that arises from calculus. She weighed Lily's face against the chance of being noticed, and chose action. Sarah bumped the sunken foot of her tray against the base of the table. It was a slip that made sense. Wine splatter, an apology, an exchange. She moved in close as she murmured a soft contrition. Her hands were steady.
She picked up the wine glass Philip had targeted and replaced it with one from her tray, her palm cool against crystal at just the right second. The swap was so slight, no one at the table heard it. No one saw the microsecond she leaned forward, the angle of her body shielding the motion. To them, she was a waiter doing a job. To her, it was a rescue. There are gestures that belong to those who work with fragile things. She had done them 1,000 times, with plates, with babies, with hearts. She set the new glass down in the place where the old one had been, and she saw Don Marcelli's hand move. He paused. His gaze, which had been mildly resting on the conversation, shifted with an almost imperceptible precision and stopped on her like the end of a sentence. He tipped the glass away from his mouth, a fraction of an inch, and smiled as if retrieving a memory. The wine did not meet him. Philip made no mistake in keeping his face schooled. The men went on, some forced laughter, the hum of speech. But the air had changed. It felt as if a soft glass shatter had been stopped before sound. When she cleared the last plate, Marco, a man who owed her favors and had never returned them in kindness, slid her a folded bill with 2 fingers. It was a large amount, and she felt it like a door opening. She had never made such a sum in a night without pulling overtime at the diner where the cooks burned onions and let the radio grow dusty on weekends. But money was a quick balm. It could fix a leaking pipe, buy a winter coat, pay tuition deposit. She kept the bill in the inner pocket of her jacket where Lily's picture peered out of the fabric. There was something else on the table before she left, a thin card, stark black, with a single glyph embossed like a salted word. On the inside, beneath the pressed velvet, someone had written a line and tucked it under the salt cellar. Thank you. It was the kind of thanks that could mean a lifetime of favors or a simple human acknowledgement. The private room's door closed behind her like a soft promise. She walked back into the dining room with her hands empty and her stomach roiling with adrenaline and a strange satisfaction. Don Marcelli had not thanked anyone. He had watched, and that watching will grow into something. Backstage at Romano's, the staff traded the small gossip that feeds a long night. Who tipped what, the tiny dramas of the table, the rumor that the Don had been set upon by someone inside his circle. Sarah kept her mouth shut. She kept her eye on the manager, who gave her a look that asked no questions but held weight. The staff had rules about these things. Do not speak of what you see. Do not alter the balance. Tonight the rules were flexible. Later, when she stepped into the rain to go home, the streetlights smeared into dirty watercolor. Her hair was damp, her scarf had a faint perfume of garlic, and Lily's school lunch was still cooling with the bread placed within it. She thought of making it quick. Soup, a story read twice, the radiators that coughed in the cold. She tucked the extra bill away and checked the threadbare lining of her coat by feel. It would be enough for a week of lunches and a bus pass. She could breathe a little easier. At home, the radiator clanked with a small, familiar drama, and Lily lay asleep on her stomach with one sock on and the other half off. The apartment held the small proofs of their life together. A library of hand-me-downs, a jar of markers with one lid missing, a small plant on the sill that refused to die. Sarah moved like a shadow not to wake Lily. She brushed a sticky hand from Lily's hair, a place where strawberry shampoo always left a scent, and told her, half-voiced, that tomorrow would be better. Parenting had trained Sarah to believe in telling the truth that fit. We will manage. She fell into bed and tried to let the night gather around her. But sleep was a small, shy thing, and long habits of listening for bad sounds had become a fossil in her bones. After 2 hours, pulling the ceiling for threats, she rose to make tea. Her phone buzzed with the kind of call that comes from numbers not in your life. It was a string of digits with no name. She let it go to voicemail. The voice that came back on the screen was clipped, machinery, and then cut off. The next morning, the world leaned over again. There was work, Lily's backpack, toast burnt at one corner because her mind already took the corner of the room that needed fixing. At the bus stop, Sarah watched other mothers talk in tidy waves about school plays and dentist appointments. She envied the way their worries sat at the surface of their sentences, not like an engine running the whole car. She clutched her coat and held Lily closer. When she returned to Romano's for overtime, there was a new tension in the air. Marco moved like a man who had fed a wolf and worried it might bite back. The kitchen hissed with pans. The dining room felt as if it had learned a new silence. The private room was booked again for the dawn. Rumors smelled like burnt coffee and passed through like steam. Sarah found herself assigned as if the restaurant had looked at her and decided she was the person best suited to the risk. She told herself it was a coincidence. She told herself she was tired and it was better not to think too hard. Halfway through the second night, after salads and after one man had asked a question that had too much weight for small talk, Sarah noticed movement under the table she had not seen before. A pair of hands, Philip's, rested on the underside like a spider. He lifted a finger, then a small bottle slid across to him, almost unseen, a ripple of fabric and skin. He touched his wrist as if checking his pulse, and then moved the bottle as if to drop it into his own pocket. The smallness of the motion made it worse. It meant cunning, patience, a plan that took time and alteration. She had 3 seconds again.
She was not the same person she had been last week, or even last night. Disappearance had honed into attention. She could have asked someone else. She could have made a scene. But those are dangerous choices in rooms that like silence. Instead, she caused the smallest possible smallness, an accident that seemed like a human failing. She brushed against the tablecloth, just enough to send a crumb tumbling, and said, "I'm so sorry." In that human apology, she reached for the glass again, this time with the practiced movement of a woman who had learned the language of plates and pocketed dangers. She moved the glass. This time the motion was cleaner. It felt like a heartbeat. She poured herself a topping of courage and set the glass down in a way that made the Don lift his head with the curiosity of a man who had been spared from a brush with an invisible knife. He looked at her, and this time his eyes softened by the width of a thought. He tipped away from the wine again, barely, an inch that carried meaning. After the meal, after the men had left with the hush of expensive coats, Marco pulled Sarah aside. He said, "Don't talk. Don't repeat what you think you saw." He slid a plain brown envelope into her hand with his thumb on top like a seal. It was not the kind of envelope that held a tip. It had a different weight, an apology or a warning tucked inside. Sarah opened it under the fluorescent hum of the kitchen at the back. There was a note, printed, not handwritten. You did what needed to be done. She had saved him, she realized, and he had seen. Outside the private room, Don Marcelli had paused under the doorway and looked back. It was not the stare of a man who would be grateful forever, but it was the look of someone parsing a debt and deciding how to account for it. The man who owed that glance had scars he'd never show. There are people whose gestures are accounts kept in silence, and when they notice a kindness, they tally it and put it where it might become useful later. Sarah, carrying the envelope and the bill in her pocket, and Lily's small life in her arms, walked home with a secret she had not sought. The first sign that something else was happening came 3 days later. Her phone vibrated in a pattern she had not memorized. Unknown caller, silent on the line. Then another, a voice that sounded like someone testing a model, asking about hours at Romano's and asking to speak to a Sarah Mitchell. It was the sort of call you tell yourself is wrong number, then keep under watch. That night, someone walked past her building twice, footsteps eaten by the rain. A car idled where cars rarely idled. Once, at 2 a.m, someone rattled the apartment door handle, one soft test that did not turn. Sarah thought of leaving, of packing Lily and going to her neighbor Mrs. Peterson's spare room. But Mrs. Peterson had a bad back, and a heart that did not stretch that far. Sarah thought of calling the police. She thought for 2 minutes, and then thought of Lily's homework, of her job, of the fact that the police often meant a kind of attention she could not afford. She knew which option meant waiting in line for paperwork that would take months. She knew which one might cost her custody hours when she couldn't make court appearances and the day job stacked against her. So she stayed cautious. She changed locks when she could afford new ones, and she double-checked the timer on the heater. She taught Lily a code phrase to use if she ever needed to get out in a hurry. She walked the route to school with her shoulders up so she could see if anyone followed. A card arrived in a plain envelope a week later. No handwriting, only a short sentence on ivory stock. Meet me at the corner table in the cafe on Hanover at noon. I can explain. Her pulse jumped to a rhythm she had practiced for small emergencies. She knew with an odd clarity that whoever wrote the note had the power to make the world tilt. There were options stacked like coins in her head. Ignore it, call Marco and tell him, set a trap with someone watching, go and demand to know the price of the favor she had purchased that night. She checked Lily into school and walked to the cafe with a stomach like a fist. The Hanover Cafe was the kind of place where freelancers came to pretend their work was a novel, and old men read the same section of the paper every morning for comfort. It was neutral. No chandeliers, no red walls. When she sat at the corner table, she tried to be ordinary. She drank bad coffee and folded napkins into tiny squares in her hands. An older man arrived with a newspaper folded under his arm. He sat down across from her without looking at her, like he had rehearsed the move. He had a clean face and clothes that cost more than Sarah's entire monthly budget. He smelled faintly of something expensive and unsentimental. His eyes, when they met hers, were small and assessing. "You switched the glass," he said, and it sounded less like an accusation than a statement of the weather. He had the cadence of someone who had watched a thing long enough to grow bored of it. He folded the paper and watched her. She wanted to ask why he sat so comfortably when he could have called the police, when he could have stomped in and demanded an explanation. The room was a map of possibilities. She kept her hands on the cup to keep them from shaking. "Why?" she asked. It had more self-defense than curiosity in it. "Because you were moving like someone who had to get home to a sleeping child," he said. He said it like an accounting. He was not the Don. He introduced himself as Marco said he would. A friend. Not a friend in the way neighbors are friends, but in the way a man can be a measure for another man's decisions. He pushed a photo across the table. It was security footage, grainy, but clear enough. There she was, in the video. Bending, fingers touching glass, the tray a blur.
"You didn't have to do that," he said. He said it gently. "You could have stayed out of it." She could have shrugged. Instead, she said, "I couldn't not." He looked at her then, and for the first time he opened a space around himself that didn't smell of command. He told her, in the kind of language that made reality both weighty and simple, someone had tried to make it look like an accident. They had been trying to hurt him. The man who sat across from her had reasons he didn't give, reasons that now stood like unread books in the space between them. He said there were fractures in his world, people who thought their cue was violence, not silence, people who wanted him gone. He told her there would be consequences to what she had done and to what he had seen. He told her there would be offers and dangerous inquiries. "And you trust me because?" Sarah asked. He smiled as if the question was a chess piece and placed the card on the table, black, impressed with the same glyph she had found under the salt cellar. "I noticed a thing that some people don't notice," he said. "I remember names when I need them. I remember faces when I have to." He told her not to speak of details. He said this softly, like someone laying down a law and a favor in the same breath. He offered without lavishness that if she felt threatened, she should come and he would make sure she was safe. He did not promise a lifetime of money or a fairy tale. His tone made clear that favors were not free and that gratitude carried weight. But he said the threat was real and he had people who could find things, and also people who could keep someone quiet, and he said he preferred the former. After he left, Sarah sat with her coffee cooling like an afterthought. At the bus stop that afternoon, she noticed a car, black, window darkened, parked a little too long near the corner where she usually crossed. She felt the sensation she had learned to know in the hard school of being watched, the prickling of skin at the nape of the neck, the small expectation that someone would open a door they had no right to. That night, she took out the envelope with the brown paper and the words, "You did what needed to be done." She smoothed it flat and put it in the drawer with Lily's mismatched mittens. She told herself stories to keep courage at hand. She told herself she had done what she had to do. But scares have a way of asking for rent. The city waited for her to pay. Days blurred into each other with a clarity Sarah had not been used to seeing. Someone left a bouquet of small white flowers at the doorway, anonymous, without note. A man in a suit who introduced himself as an insurance representative asked her routine questions about her shifts. She told him that the restaurant had values and that she worked nights. He smiled a smile that did not match conditions and left his card on the table with tidy printed letters.
Sarah began to notice the pattern. People arriving by the edges, a scraping of things that fit and did not fit her life. It felt like a tide adjusting to a stone dropped into shallow water. At the end of the week, when the city was a blur of traffic and tired commuters, Sarah walked out of the building and saw the same black car across the street. This time, someone got out. He stood there, hands in his coat pockets, sizing up the staircase to her building as if he'd been given the job of checking it. A second man remained in the car. They smelled like neutral things, like a coat that meant nothing and made everything worse. She could have called Marco at Romano's, but there were rules people knew, and she was newly aware of which ones controlled her now. She walked straight up the stairs, holding Lily's small hand for a second longer because her daughter's warmth steadied the world. Inside, she locked the door and checked the chain twice. She kept a pan by the bed for a ridiculous domestic joke of protection, and a flashlight in the drawer. She slept with one eye closed. The next afternoon, a man in a clean blazer knocked on her door. He said calmly that he was a friend of Mr. Marcelli. He asked if she would come to speak somewhere quiet. His voice had the smoothing quality of someone assigned the job of making people feel safe. Sarah measured him, and then let him in for a cup of tea. He apologized for the intrusion into her life, and he said nothing about the black car. When she asked plainly why he had come, his answer was almost tender. He wants to say thank you, he said, and he wants to keep you safe. Her mouth tasted of metal and caution. Offers from people with means are complicated. There is a bottom line in how favors look. A hand extended may hold a gift or a noose. Sarah's instinct was to distrust the kind of kindness that came with a ledger. She was tired of having to choose between two kinds of bad. But Lily's face, sleeping in the next room, simplified the calculus. She could not ignore the threat. She could not risk the unknown men who watched. She accepted the idea of going to see him not because she trusted him, but because she could no longer afford to pretend the danger was not real. The man smiled the polite, cramped smile of someone happy to have moved the chess pieces in the right way. He left with the kind of calm that did not carry a promise. When she arrived at the cafe where he had asked to meet, she found a quieter corner than before, a place where conversation bounced off the windows and softened the edges of questions. He sat straight-backed and removed his gloves even though it was warm inside. He did not introduce himself as Don Marcelli. He kept his hands on the table like a man not interested in theatrics. He spoke with surprising economy. He asked first if she was hurt. She said no. He asked then if she had thought what she did would place her in danger. She said yes. He listened without interrupting. When he did speak, his voice had the flatness of someone who had had to make decisions when it cost him, privately, in ways the world would never know. "You saved me," he said. The sentence was not a claim of ownership, it was a factual accounting. He did not lay a crown on it. He did not expect her gratitude. He was making a ledger and adding her entry. She looked at her hands, at the ink ring on her finger where she had not yet taken off a cheap ring she bought at a shop downtown. She had no illusions about her actions making her a saint. She had only the demonstrable fact of her daughter who needed to sleep warm and of a job that would hold next week. He told her, plainly and without melodrama, that the attempt had not been an accident. It had been made to look like one. Someone had wanted him gone. He gave the reason as if it was a geographic fact. Power stacks poorly. He said there were people inside his circle who wanted the chair he sat in and who thought pushing him out would be tidy if they could not live under his rule. He said he was not a man who wanted blood on the street, not because he lacked the capability, but because he preferred a different kind of accounting. He wanted things settled by exposure and by the cold light of evidence. He said he would not use blood because blood is a thing that leaves stains, and his life had answers he did not want to keep forever. Sarah listened. She had never been one for allegiances that required anything more than paying the rent with a job and showing up. But tonight the way he spoke of choices sounded like a man who had put down weapons for reasons she could understand in a way she could not afford to judge. He was offering her a kind of defense that fit the edges of her life, discreet, not theatrical, effective in ways that would not make headlines. "I can make sure you're safe," he said, "and my people can make sure whoever tried to hurt me is exposed." She asked because it was the only honest question she had. "Why me?" He folded his hands, and for the first time something almost like a softness came through. "Because you acted like someone who needed to be home," he said. "You moved as a mother moves. Most people don't move like that." There was a pause then, the kind of silence that stacks the world in front of both of you. Outside, the city pressed close to windows and buses and the ordinary guilelessness of people who did not need to count the seconds before a stranger's hand. Inside, Sarah thought of Lily's small socks, of the nursing certificate she had not yet paid for, of the night classes she went to in the hopes of a career that would not be bent around shift work and debt. The offer was dangerous, it was complicated, and it was perhaps the only tangible thing between her and the slow decay of precariousness. "What do you want in return?" she asked. "Money? Protection? My silence?" He shook his head like a man who disliked the idea of bargaining in pop culture metaphors. "I want your life not to change," he said. "I want you to be able to go to school, to raise your daughter without fear. If you accept help, I only ask you to keep yourself. No obligations beyond that. You will not be a messenger for me. You will be safe, and you will be free." It sounded like a gift. It sounded like leverage. Sarah had lived a life where choices came wrapped in strings, where favors had small print. She thought of the nights she sat in class taking notes on nursing, the glow of possibility like a distant streetlight. She thought of Lily sleeping with a stuffed animal whose eye was already starting to come undone. She imagined a small life made sturdier. "You can't buy my future," she said, But if you help me, I'll take it and I'll earn it. He nodded. We can do that. He left with a business-like politeness. There was no herald, no cinematic flourish. He stepped into the rain and the city swallowed him. She walked home with a steady thing in her chest that was equal parts fear and relief and small hope. If anything, the choice to accept help drew attention the way a spark draws moths. The black car returned, more often now, idling without reason. A man took to sitting opposite the deli near her building and reading a paper he did not seem to finish. Once, a neighbor called to say there had been someone asking for Sarah on her floor. Sarah began to change routines. She took a different path to school and back. She taught Lily to put away the backpacks in the same place every afternoon and to lock the door with the chain even if it seemed silly. She practiced the code words they had chosen together. At the restaurant, the staff treated her like a roomer with weight. People guessed and then looked away. In the kitchen, someone left a dish unwashed for her as a kindness. Someone else folded a napkin into a heart and set it on her station. Money moved in ways she had not known how to accept before. Small payments slipped into the register from anonymous accounts. Checks for school boarded with explanations short and tidy. Don Marcelli sent a driver to fix her heater in the middle of a blizzard. He sent a man to help with rent that had been late by an afternoon. He never inserted himself into her life loudly. The favors came as if the city had decided to add a new weather pattern, quietly, predictably, and with a generosity that left a bruise of suspicion beneath it. Months unfurled in a nervous, practical rhythm. She worked. Lily thrived in ways small and stubborn. Sarah kept her classes at the community college and paid attention in lectures on anatomy and patience. The name nurse became a map she traced with her finger at night, as if practice could lead to sanctified change. The donors who did not announce themselves made it possible for her to buy textbooks, to pay for a practicum fee, to breathe a little.
But favors have a tense edge. They ask for trust, and trust is expensive. Sometimes a man would appear at the door to ask a favor, or his vehicle would idle on the curb like a waiting animal. Once, a man in a cheap suit left a packet of photographs on the steps, pictures of people she did not know, marked with dates and numbers. She handed them to Don Marcelli's assistant, a quiet woman with a sharp haircut, who told Sarah to keep her head down and her phone off in the evenings if she could. One night, as snow hid the city like a soft lie, Sarah found a polite envelope slipped under her door. Inside was a photograph of the private room at Romano's. Someone had taken a shot of inside, 2 tables set, and in the corner a woman leaning over a glass. On the back, a single sentence: "Know when to be grateful." The message was not a threat, but it was a reminder that people kept ledgers, and that gratitude could be a currency that required exacting returns. Sarah pressed the paper to her lips, then folded it and placed it beside Lily's homework. She felt the river of her life change course under her feet. She had been rescued once, and rescue does not come without consequence. It draws lines, and lines mean men who count. When she least expected it, Don Marcelli came to see her in a way that changed the scale of things. He did not come with men or with flourish. He sent one of his assistants to arrange a meeting downtown, and then stepped into a cafe corner like she had never seen him before. Less a man in a myth, and more an ordinary adult who had learned too much too young, and now wanted different things for reasons he would not explain. There was no offer of romance, no predatory rhetoric. He was careful with his words, and in the carefulness she detected a strange sort of sorrow. "You saved me," he told her again, as if repeating the fact would make it less transactional, "and I am not the kind of man who forgets." She understood that in languages of power, this was a promise. Promises in that vocabulary could be armor, or they could be a demand, or both. She also understood, with the same clarity as the day she switched the glass, that the security he offered would be measured, and that she would be part of its accounting. When she left the cafe and walked into the rain, the world felt altered. She had stepped into a different register of life, one where people noticed, where money moved like rainwater into gutters she had previously only watched. She had opened a door. And doors create drafts. The black car that had been a phantom at the curb was now a presence she could trace. It sat with people who took notes and watched the building. One of them followed her across a crosswalk, keeping a distance that made her stomach drop. When she turned, he looked like a man who had been paid to look harmless.
Back at home, Sarah lay awake and counted out costs, the tuition she could now pay, the safety she had bought against the price of watchful eyes, the unknown ledger that would come due one day. She turned her face to the ceiling and tried to name the future she wanted: a nurse's uniform, a day shift that didn't end with frying oil in her hair, bedtime stories without the shadow of worry. She wanted Lily to grow up not knowing the sharpness of being watched. For the first time since she became a mother, she let herself imagine such a thing as plausible. The city, apparently, was not done with its counters. 2 nights later, a man tapped at her door, his finger checking the brass as if testing for warmth. She looked through the peephole and saw a pair of dress shoes and a coat. He left a small envelope on the stoop and walked away without looking back. Inside the envelope was a ticket stub and an invitation to a private hearing. It read only, "Come alone." Her breath tightened as if a cord had been pulled. She was now a person in a game she had not agreed to join, offered another level of exposure she had to think through. She thought of Lily sleeping with the glove she cherished. She thought of the slow, steady climb to nursing, the test she would have to pass. She thought, too, of the man who had watched her switch the glass and had found reasons to reach into her life. She did not sleep that night. The next morning, on the way to the bus, she noticed a man standing under the streetlight near the corner where Lily's school bus stopped. He had a paper in his hand and a watch that betrayed wealth. He was not watching her as she crossed the street. He was watching past her, toward the place where the sidewalk met the stoop, where someone else might appear. For a second, Sarah thought the man was waiting for someone he knew. Then she saw the small motion. His hand lifted and a device glinted in the light. Nothing dramatic, only a phone, but his eyes were fixed the way a hunter's eyes fix, measuring angles and time. He made her feel small and obvious in a way the world rarely had. She quickened her step and Lily caught up, breath puffing out in cold clouds. Sarah kept her face calm, the practiced neutral of someone used to moving in public while privately counting possibilities. They reached the apartment and she fumbled the key, the metal cool and familiar. Inside, she slid the deadbolt and listened to the apartment sigh into itself. The street noise dimmed, and for a long minute, relief washed across her like warm water. Then there was a knock. It was soft. 3 quick taps, then a pause. Someone testing the brass. Her first instinct was to send Lily into the bedroom and stand at the other side of the door with the pan she kept for improbable defenses. Her second was to remember the code phrase and the list of places she could run.
Her third was a quieter, older logic that settled in her spine. Do not show the fear that invites a test. "Mrs. Mitchell?" a voice called, careful, measured. "We're from building management." She peered through the peephole. A man stood on the step with a clipboard and a respectful distance. His shoes were scuffed. He looked ordinary. "It's all right." She opened the door a crack, enough to make the door stay locked behind it. "What do you need?" He gave a small half-smile and indicated the clipboard. "Routine check, just updating records. May I come in?" Sarah watched his hands. They were empty. The glance through the chain told her nothing. She had learned that danger often wore ordinary clothes. She kept Lily behind her and let the man in for the span of a polite conversation. He asked about the thermostat. He asked if the heater was working. He took notes with a pen that seemed to chew the silence. When he left, he thanked her for her time and slid a small postcard in her hand. Building inspection next month. After the door closed, she leaned against it for a second until the thrum in her chest eased. The card lay in her palm like a small insult. The little tests multiplied in ways that wore on Sarah. A shadow that lingered too long across the street. A woman in an unremarkable coat who asked Lily directions and then smiled like someone who had come to study a map. A man photographing the building's facade from a van parked 2 blocks away. None of it was overt. None of it forced itself into police reports the way a crime in a movie forced itself onto headlines. It was a pressure, incremental and deliberate. It was the kind of attention that could be used until the seams frayed. Don Marcelli did not allow seams to fray very long. He did not come with sirens or threats. He came with a plan set in small, decisive steps. The driver arrived at dawn, a car in neutral gray that smelled faintly of citrus and winter. The man who opened the rear door had the same clean fingers Sarah had seen at the cafe months before. He introduced himself as Luca and was the kind of person who understood that safety is often delivered as logistics. He treated Lily like a child and Sarah like a list that needed checking. "You come with us," he said plainly. "We'll keep you someplace quiet while we sort things out." She hesitated. She had to trust a man who was the face of a debt she had never asked to owe. She checked Lily's face and saw the small curve of trust in sleep. She thought of Mrs. Peterson and the radiator she could not fix. She thought of school applications she had paid in tiny installments. She thought of how thin she felt around the edges. "Just for a few days," Luca added, as if it explained absolutes. "We'll put you someplace quiet and someone who can take messages for you. No obligations." That was the way he said it. No obligations. It contained both a promise and a warning.
It was the sort of phrasing a person trained to make things happen uses to keep the world moving without jolts. She packed the essentials: a change of clothes, Lily's favorite stuffed rabbit, the nursing backpack with textbooks she could not bear to leave behind. Her hands went light over the things she loved, the way someone patting a pocket checks for keys. The driver smiled with no mercy, and they left the apartment. The safe house smelled like lemon cleaner and dust. It had curtains that closed and a spare set of towels folded at the foot of the bed. A woman named Rosa showed Lily how to fold tiny towels into little triangles, the way a waitress learns to fold napkins into hearts. The routine calmed the child, and watching Lily accept a strange woman's kindness without fuss eased something raw inside Sarah's ribs. In the small house, phones were registered, schedules changed. Don Marcelli's people moved in precise patterns: a private investigator who could read a ledger like a map, a woman fluent in local law who could explain how to pass information to the right hands, a quiet tech who worked at the edge of legality to pull together metadata and logs. Their work was methodical. They were trying to assemble a truth that would not be blunted by the power of silence. For Sarah, those first days in the safe house were a blur of phone calls on hold and unfamiliar breakfasts. The world reduced to a few rooms, the way a map reduces oceans to blue space. She attended classes online in the mornings, notes spread on a kitchen table under a lamp. She fed Lily cereal and read aloud from picture books that had little to do with examinations and everything to do with rescue. Even in safety, fear settled like a film on mornings. She would wake and listen for anything that sounded like an attempt to cross the boundary. While she could not control what had happened in the private room, she could choose what to do next. She could continue to study. She could learn to be an adult in a world that often expected children to carry their own bags. Don Marcelli's team worked in the gray seam between legitimate pressure and quiet advantage. They traced small payments to offshore accounts and found curious entries in corporate expense ledgers that suggested someone was funneling resources the way a gardener moves water through hidden hoses. They found a name repeated, Philip Warren, booked under innocuous descriptions and small amounts. They collected footage from street cameras that showed men moving in the direction of the restaurant the night before the dinner. Nothing was a smoking gun. That is, nothing would carry weight on its own. But strings of small, seemingly unrelated facts began to knit into an accusation. A week into their stay, Sarah's phone, a burner the team had rented under her name, vibrated. A message blinked on the screen with the kind of brevity that belonged to men used to economy. "We need you to identify a voice. Can you come to the office?" The office was not an office, but a small room in a legal firm where an older woman sat behind a glass desk and listened more than she spoke. In the recorder, she played a single minute of sound, a man's voice, clipped and calm, discussing terms, asking who would be in the private room, the tone casual enough to be deadly. Sarah listened. The hair rose along her forearms, in that place where memory lives as sensation. It was Philip's voice. Smallness moved into something like resolve. She did not expect herself to identify it with certainty. She had noticed its cadence the way someone notices a neighbor's laugh. When she said the name aloud, Philip Warren, the woman on the phone nodded so slightly it might have been imagined. The legal woman explained in plain language, "Evidence is not a singular explosion. It is a weather that corrodes falsehoods. We have enough to ask questions. If you agree, we can take this to the proper authorities and let them do what they are good at." "Will they protect me?" Sarah asked. The voice that came back was level. "They will place you in witness protection if necessary," the woman said. "They will make a record. They will put facts on paper a judge can read." Witness protection. Those words carried the theater of movies and the cold practicality of legal systems. The offer felt like a doorway, but one on the other side of which the life she had been knitting might unravel into procedures she could not control. She remembered Lily's small face and the way she had learned to tie shoes. Sarah felt the weight of being at once ordinary and dangerous. She chose to proceed, but not blindly. She asked for guarantees, that Lily's schooling would not be interrupted, that she would be told the timeline, that she would have access to her textbooks and her notes. The legal woman agreed to as much as she could and promised to coordinate with Don Marcelli's people to ensure the practical needs were met. The first outward strike was quiet. The team delivered a packet to a contact at a local newspaper, a dry cover letter, a selection of ledger entries, a series of questions. The paper could publish, but the more effective tactic was a private one. Go to a prosecutor with the packet and ask for a grand jury review. Marcelli's network supplied the legal path with the necessary breadcrumbs. Philip noticed the pressure before it became public. People like him are not indolent. They smell change the way a hound senses terrain. He made mistakes, phone calls to numbers that appeared on those ledgers, a hurried attempt to shift funds that rang too loudly across accounts. Under the light of scrutiny, small lies look like theater. They move awkwardly. When Philip realized he was being watched, he tried the only thing a small-time operator with access to more powerful men could attempt. He tried to make himself useful by blaming others. He called names, he offered stories, he tried to bargain. For a while, his mouth moved like a spinning blade, flinging accusations that were part truth and part self-preservation. That did not stop the prosecutors from looking at the receipts. The day the county detective came to speak with Sarah, she felt the brink of something like finality. The detective had the kind of softness that made you feel safe enough to tell things that hurt. He asked questions she had rehearsed. He asked about the second night at Romano's, about the vial, about the men under the table. He read her statement back in slow pieces and told her not to worry about small details. Their job was to assemble the larger fact. The thing about power, he said at one point, is that it needs stories to survive. We'll make a different story. Sarah found the words strange and gratefully dull. Stories. She had always thought of them as fiction, but here was one being used as a tool. In the weeks that followed, the pressure applied at multiple angles. Philip found himself quietly subpoenaed, called into interviews with the kind of investigators who keep records in a very sanitary way. The evidence the team had gathered, bank entries, phone logs, security footage, began to knit into something heavier than rumor. There were tense moments. Once a letter arrived at the safe house, its paper thick and cold. Inside, a photograph of Sarah, taken from some angle that made her look smaller than she felt, was accompanied by a single line, "Don't get too comfortable." It was a menace without violence, which made it more efficient. Don Marcelli did not respond with threats. He sent the next day food and a voucher for warm clothes, and a man to replace a broken window on the building where Sarah had once lived. He played the longer game, exerting pressure where leverage existed, insulating the innocent where he could, using the tools of money and influence to provide legitimate buffers. He met with a prosecutor privately, someone who understood the risks of publicizing details before a case was ready, and together they agreed on a process that would bring things into the open without igniting the kind of chaos Marcelli did not want. In the end, it was not a dramatic arrest on a rain-swicked street. It was a parade of very ordinary governmental acts, a subpoena served, a transfer of funds traced, a mid-level associate quietly flipping when confronted with incontrovertible paperwork that tied him to the chain of payment. Philip's support network eroded in a way that had nothing to do with fists and everything to do with exposure. Men who thought themselves invulnerable realized they had become liabilities. They retreated, or they testified, or they fled into corners where pressure could find them later. When Philip finally came to the private room at Romano's one last time, his eyes darted like a man whose script had been taken away. He sat down and said words that were small and sharp. Don Marcelli listened. He did not shout.
He presented ledgers, quietly, with the calm of someone reading a statement to a court. He had the receipts, the paper trail, the voices that would corroborate, and the willingness to use the law rather than the street. Philip tried to bargain. He was offered the choice to cooperate. That cooperation reduced the potential for violence. It produced a route for the prosecutors to act. The resolution came in hours and papers and solemn meetings. Philip and 2 associates were indicted for conspiracy and related charges that did not make good headlines but did make for firm evidence in a courthouse. There were a few short hearings, a judge who asked practical questions, and the kind of slow paperwork that breaks a plan if done with patience. It was not spectacular. It was legal, tedious, and final. For Sarah, the moment that resembled resolution was quieter. The subpoenas and the testimony meant she slept again without checking the deadbolt every hour. The black car stopped appearing at the curb. The men on the bench in the deli found other corners to occupy. Life, in incremental ways, resumed its ordinary rhythm. Don Marcelli's help did not stop. It was not theatrical. It came as scholarships and a small, discreet trust that paid for Sarah's practicum fees and the last required exam for her nursing license. It came with a small, unsolicited job lead at a local clinic that needed a compassionate aide for pediatric care. No strings beyond honest work. He insisted on 2 conditions that were modest and radical at once: that Sarah retain her independence and that she refused to let gratitude become a new chain. "You did the right thing," he said to her once, in a coffee shop where the clatter of cups softened the starkness of the words. "I am paying a debt I do not expect to be repaid in the form of loyalty. I only ask that when you see someone who needs help, you help them." She accepted because she had no other currency to barter with,
except a promise that sounded like redemption and a next step toward the life she wanted. She worked nights, she studied during slow shifts, she practiced on mannequins and on patient charts, until the terms of medical language stopped feeling like foreign terrain. Don Marcelli sent envelopes that contained simple practical things, tuition checks that landed like seasons, a laptop so she could study at night, a note that read simply, "Keep me informed only if you need to." The safe house period stretched into months. Sarah insisted Lily remain rooted. She enrolled her in the same school with the same teacher and kept bedtime rituals intact. Lily kept her stuffed rabbit and picked up a new word, resilience, that Sarah spelled out for her like a spell. The city slowly stopped noticing them, which for Sarah felt like the greatest mercy. There were small betrayals of peace along the way. A man once left a package at the clinic where Sarah worked. It contained useless trinkets and a sheet of paper with a name she did not know.
She took it to the clinic manager, and he threw it away like compost. That was the power of new alignments. When the healthy institutions around her learned to reject the small things that masqueraded as warnings, the noise died down. When the legal dust settled, the prosecutor called and said simply that the case had been prosecuted and that in plea deals and cooperation, the ring that had aimed to unseat Don Marcelli had been dismantled enough that he could no longer operate through the same channels. There were consequences for those who had attempted to betray him. There were consequences for him as well, as certain men in power always carried debts that were messy and long. But for Sarah's part, the direct threat had been neutralized. She could breathe with a steadier chest. She used the support to finish her nursing certification and to find a job in pediatric care that fit the hours around Lily's school day. She paid the back rent that had hung like a cloud above her apartment and treated herself to a coat that fit properly. She sat in a fluorescent classroom and learned about veins and patience and the particular tenderness it takes to hold a child while cutting a Band-Aid. Her life did not unwind into something glossy. There were bills that still came in slow and biting. There were days when shifts overlapped and her lunch boiled cold in a thermos. There were nights when Lily's fever rose and she sat on the cold linoleum in the bathroom, coaxing a small breath into the world. But there was also a steadying that came from a community of people who had watched her work and who had, in their private ways, invested in a future they believed in. Months later, at her graduation from the community nursing program, the auditorium smelled of cheap perfume and proud relief. Lily sat in the front row with a new braid and a paper flower she had folded during class. Mrs. Peterson, who had bent a little with age, but whose presence was formidable in its ordinary love, sat beside her. Sarah's name was called, and she walked across the stage with hands that trembled only slightly. Don Marcelli did not appear in person. He never claimed the stage. Instead, after the ceremony, there was a slim envelope placed on the seat where Lily had left her scarf. Inside was a note, brief and careful, for the future. There was also a modest scholarship check to help with certification courses, accompanied by a list of contacts at clinics that respected people who worked hard. She understood the gesture, help without spectacle. It recognized the fact that someone had been saved and that saving costs different things to different people. Sarah folded the note into her pocket and felt gratitude that did not feel like a chain, but like a tool she could use to build. The bond between Sarah and Don Marcelli remained quiet and complicated, never a romance, never a puppet string of control. He called once in a while to ask about Lily's cough or to tell her a fact about his city, as if sharing an observation. She answered with the same frankness she used with everyone who had a stake in her life. She would not be bought, but she would accept support that allowed her to become staff at a clinic where the hours fit a child's bedtime. He listened. There were times when his voice sounded like someone measuring the world against his own past and deciding he preferred a different accounting. In the months that followed, Sarah found herself becoming the version of herself she had been studying for at night in classes. She learned to chart the soft signs pediatrics asks you to notice, the way a child's laugh changes when they stop hurting, the way a mother's eyes shift when she receives a small kindness she does not expect. She took internships at the clinic that would later become a job, and she kept a file of her receipts that someday might pay for Lily's college if the world was kind. One evening, as she made soup for Lily, the child looked up and announced solemnly, "Mama, remember when you saved the man?" Lily's innocent summary of a complicated night snapped something elastic inside Sarah, and she laughed, because a child's version of bravery is always purer than our own. "Yes," Sarah said, tucking a spoonful into a bowl. "I remember." "It was like being a superhero," Lily said. "You were very quiet." She had been quiet because silence is a form of courage.
She had been quiet because the world often expects the small among us to remain mute. She had also learned that quiet courage could be recognized by those who knew what to look for. There was a man who had watched, and in watching had chosen to count the favor as something that required repayment in a way that made space rather than debt. In time, she used the scholarship funds to pay for a continuing education course and a new laptop. She volunteered at a community health fair and led a small station on pediatric first steps. She cracked jokes with a nurse named Jenna, who taught her how to loosen a wound dressing with practical fingers and a human heart. Life continued its quiet years. The ripple of a single act did not turn the ocean. It did, however, shift the tide in the narrow shoals of their family life. Sarah's nights were no longer swallowed by the fear of being watched. She took Lily to the park and allowed herself to sit on a bench with the winter sun touching her face. She slept with one eye less sharp than before. She paid off a debt that had hung like a tight garment on her shoulders. She took a day off and bought Lily a small ice cream cone that dripped down their hands, sticky and ordinary and full of simple joy.
Years later, at a small graduation from the hospital where she worked, a ceremony attended by the cramped, devoted friends one makes in a life on call, Don Marcelli sent a note with a bouquet of white flowers and a short line, "Keep saving people who need it." He had made a donation to the hospital's pediatric wing in her honor, with a directive that it be used for training nurses who come from precarious backgrounds. It was practical, it was elegant, it was the kind of help that turned gratitude into capacity for others. He came once, briefly, to see the clinic's new wing. He stood in the doorway like someone who had learned his way around humility and responsibility. He watched Sarah kneel beside a small boy, showing him how to count to 20 so his hands would be steadier during a vaccination. He kept his distance, and when she looked up, he nodded as if checking to make sure a box had been ticked. It was not a scene from a novel where debts are paid in full with dramatic bows. It was a simple human accounting, a life tilted gently because of something small and brave. At home that night, Sarah tucked Lily in and thought of the many small switches she had made in her life. The one in the private room, the small gesture that became a long chain of practical kindness. She thought of late-night study sessions that had felt foolish and necessary, of the medical diagrams she had memorized during quiet hours, and of the way the world had leaned toward her when she allowed herself to accept help on her own terms. She touched the picture of Lily on her phone and then placed the device face down. There are moments when the past feels like an object you can put down, and the future like a room you can open into. She fell asleep with that idea in her mind, the possibility that small acts, done without fanfare, might redraw the edges of a life. In the end, the thing that mattered was not where the help came from, but what she did with it. She used it to make a home steadier, a career attainable, and a child's nights safer. She taught Lily how to tie shoelaces, how to count to 20, how to say thank you without letting gratitude become a burden. When Lily grew older and asked about the man who had watched, Sarah told the story simply and without romance. A woman saw danger and chose to act. A man saw that act. That choice made new things possible. The last scene is small and domestic. Sarah at a kitchen table, grading a practice exam for a pediatric course, a cup of tea steaming beside her. Lily is coloring at the counter and hums a tune that has nothing to do with danger. A postcard lies beside the lamp, an invitation from a hospital foundation to speak at a small event about community health. It requests only 2 paragraphs and a succinct bio. Sarah smiles and begins to write. She writes about hands that do what must be done, about the stubbornness of mothers, about the little acts people overlook. When she finishes, she folds the paper and looks out the window at the street below, where a single car passes and the city continues in its ordinary way. She presses her palms together for a moment like prayer, a small gesture to remind herself how far she has come, and then she calls Lily to wash up. If this story leaves something with you, think of the small thing you can do today that costs little and may change a life. Share it in the comments. Tell us a moment when you acted and the ripple it created. If you've watched this far and want more true-to-life cinematic stories, subscribe and tell us where you're watching from.